Hello everyone. Cuba always holds a special charm with its ancient streets and year-round warm beaches. The natural landscape here remains untouched in its pristine beauty. With an area of 109,884 square kilometers, this island nation is the 8th largest island in the world. At the same time, this is also home to approximately 11.1 million residents. Thus, the population density is approximately 100 people per square kilometer. The national territory consists of a main island shaped like a crocodile, named Cuba. And the second largest island is Isla de la Juventud, also known as the Isle of Youth. Cuba is located east of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and west of the island nation of Haiti. The northern part of the island nation of Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. Notably, Cuba is located just about 160 kilometers south of the U.S. state of Florida. Living next to a superpower like that, Cuba's economy could have had much greater potential for robust growth. However, in reality, this country's economy is growing slowly and facing many difficulties. Why does such a paradox exist? How has Cuba's geographical location and natural conditions influenced its development process? Let's take 5 minutes to explore in today's video. Is Cuba's geographical location the reason for its difficulties? If the U.S. considers Latin America its backyard, then Cuba is the doorstep to that garden. Therefore, the position of Hoang Dao in the eyes of policymakers in Washington is extremely important. To understand Cuba's significance, we must go back in history to the time when the United States gained independence and established its nation in 1783. At this time, the territory of the United States stretched only from the Atlantic Ocean to the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. In 1803, U.S. President Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase from France, doubling the nation's territory. Owning this land means Washington gains full control over the entire Mississippi River basin. Thanks to the dense river network, farmers in the Midwest can transport their agricultural products along tributaries that flow into the Mississippi River, then downstream to the city of New Auckland. The country's largest cargo port remains operational, where agricultural products are shipped to Europe by ocean-going vessels. Although the United States had virtually gained control of the entire Mississippi River system, including New Orleans, it still could not access the sea due to Spain's control over the outlet. Therefore, from 1808 to 1845, they waged multiple wars to annex Florida and Texas into U.S. territory. However, the Spanish still held onto Cuba, the last thorn in America's side. This island lies between the Florida Peninsula in the United States and the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. At the same time, the distance from Cuba's capital, Havana, to the strategic port city of New Auckland is only 1,078 kilometers. At this time, Spain was weakening, which also presented an opportunity for the U.S. to rise. However, the country still feared that the British would seize the chance to take over Cuba. At that time, the British Empire had established a colony in the Bahamas, an archipelago located near Cuba. If it falls into the hands of a hostile power, the crocodile-shaped island will become a dagger aimed straight at New Auckland and the vital lands along the Mississippi River. Thus, seizing Cuba became a vital mission in the strategy of successive White House administrations. Under President Abraham Lincoln, the United States spent $160 million, equivalent to approximately $5.9 billion in today's value, aiming to buy back Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain. But the American delegation rejected this agreement, after which the Washington administration immediately drew up plans to invade Cuba. In 1898, an explosion caused the battleship USS Maine to sink in the port of Havana. Immediately, the United States declared war on Spain. Thanks to its overwhelming strength, the U.S. military defeated the declining empire across the Atlantic in just 3 months. The war ended when Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba. At the same time, they also ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Among the territories the United States gained from Spain, only Cuba regained its independence. Nevertheless, the United States still has the right to intervene in matters concerning the crocodile-shaped island. At the same time, maintain control over the entire economy. At the same time, the United States was also granted the right to lease a 120 square kilometers naval base at Guantanamo Bay, located in the southeastern part of Cuba. At a cost of $2,000 per year, this base not only helps the U.S. control Cuba but also dominates the vast Caribbean Sea. Before World War II, fearing Germany's growing influence in Cuba, the Washington administration did everything it could to bring Fulgencio Batista to power. Not only did he kill 20,000 people in 7 years, but he also allowed foreign companies to manipulate the market. This angered the Cuban people, leading them to side with the resistance movement led by Fidel Castro. The result was that on January 1, 1959, Batista's regime was overthrown, and Fidel Castro became the new leader of Cuba. Afterward, Fidel Castro declared that this Caribbean island nation would become an inseparable part of the global socialist bloc. This action led to the United States officially severing diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961. And then, the confrontation between the two factions erupted on this island nation, with the Cuban Missile Crisis being the most prominent example. If the United States sees Cuba as a stepping stone into Latin America, then according to many analysts, if the Soviet Union wanted a position to threaten Washington's interests, no place would be more ideal than Cuba. Shortly after the U.S. severed diplomatic relations and imposed an economic embargo on Cuba, Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, remarked, "If the Soviet Union did not act promptly to protect it, this island nation could very well fall into the hands of the United States." Afterwards, dozens of nuclear-tipped missiles were secretly transported to Cuba. At this point, the Kennedy administration fully grasped the severity of the issue. Alongside intensifying efforts to mobilize armed forces, they also secretly established covert communication channels. By October 28, 1962, thanks to goodwill from both sides and the mediation of the United Nations, the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle all missiles deployed in Cuba. The United States pledged not to attack Cuba in the future and agreed to dismantle certain nuclear bases in Europe, formally ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. When discussing Cuba's economy, it can be divided into two main phases, before and after the revolution. Before the revolution, Cuba's economy was largely dependent on the United States. Shortly after gaining independence in 1902, American companies controlled up to 80% of Cuba's ore exports. Moreover, the majority of sugar and tobacco factories, along with about 10% of Cuba's total land area, were in the hands of foreign citizens. By 1959, American companies controlled 40% of sugarcane growing land, nearly all livestock farms, and 90% of mines and mineral exploitation rights. Equipment and its entire oil industry rely on imports, accounting for up to 2% of the country. Thanks to its geographical proximity to the United States, Cuba has long been a favored vacation spot for the wealthy. They come here mainly to engage in activities such as gambling, horse racing, and golf, thereby boosting tourism into a key economic sector. At that time, the capital Havana was a bustling and vibrant city. However, Cuban society is marked by deep inequality, with racial discrimination being one of the most pressing issues in the country. Before the revolution, this island nation was often depicted with a panorama of bustling cities and a standard of living on par with many European countries. The Eastern Village has social conditions similar to plantations in South America. After the successful revolution in 1959, relations between Cuba and the United States quickly became strained as the Cuban government nationalized the assets of foreign companies. When Washington lost control over the island's politics, this government pressured Havana to fall in line with its orbit. The government imposed an import embargo and strictly blocked all financial flows to Cuba. Conflict with the United States left Fidel Castro no choice but to forge a strong alliance with the Soviet Union. This country has agreed to purchase 5 million tons of sugar from Cuba over 5 years, while also lending Cuba 100 million rubles to import heavy machinery at an annual interest rate of 2.5%, with a repayment term of 12 years. By May 1960, the Cuban government began importing weapons from the Soviet Union. Just 1 month later, the Washington administration halted oil exports to Cuba, forcing the island nation to turn to importing crude oil from the Soviets. The two countries signed a trade agreement, in which Russia committed to supplying approximately 6.3 million barrels of oil to Cuba. The United States viewed this agreement as a provocative act and demanded that the three companies, Esso, Texaco, and Shell, stop processing crude oil from the Soviet Union. Immediately, Cuba nationalized these refineries. Since then, Cuba has become increasingly dependent on economic aid from the Soviet Union. Thanks to the support of its socialist big brother, Cuba's economy developed steadily until the late 1980s. S economy fell into a severe crisis, leading to acute food shortages. By 1993, the country. To address the difficult situation, since July 1993, the Cuban government has implemented socio-economic reforms. This country has reformed its agricultural production model, transferring land use rights from the state to cooperatives and individual households, and reviving the operation of agricultural markets. At the same time, the government has also legalized the use of foreign currency and allowed Cuban expatriates to send money back to support their relatives in the country. This island nation also focuses on developing economic sectors that generate foreign currency revenue, with particular emphasis on strategic areas such as tourism, biotechnology, and oil and gas exploration and extraction. Cuba is also accelerating the development of its handicraft industry and small retail businesses while reforming its public administrative apparatus. The country is also implementing reforms in the banking and financial system, establishing new tax policies, and granting greater economic autonomy to local governments. Since 1995, Cuba's economy has gradually recovered with GDP growth reaching 2.5%, and it has continued to maintain stable growth momentum in the following years. However, the embargoes still heavily impact Cuba's economy, forcing this crocodile-shaped island to rely largely on agriculture. How have Cuba's terrain and climate influenced its agriculture? Approximately 15% of Cuba's land area consists of plains, primarily featuring flat or gently rolling terrain in some regions, with an average elevation below 100 meters above sea level. Although an island nation, Cuba is home to many rivers, such as the Cauto, Zaza, Saguila Grande, Canao, and Toa rivers. Most of these rivers are short and have a fairly swift current. Among them, the Cauto River is the longest in the country, stretching 371 kilometers. It flows through the southeastern part of Hoang Chin Island and deposits fertile silt, creating rich agricultural lands. Cuba has a humid subtropical climate with two distinct seasons. The rainy season here is quite humid with constant winds, lasting from late April through the end of November. During the dry season, the weather here is quite cool and usually lasts from late November to mid-April of the following year. The average annual temperature in Cuba is 26 degrees Celsius, while the island nation's yearly rainfall ranges from 1,000 to 1,500 millimeters. Thanks to the fairly favorable natural conditions and climate, the plains across the country have become home to the majority of the population. This area is not only a vibrant economic hub but also boasts the most favorable conditions for agricultural development in the entire Caribe region. According to estimates by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, Cuba's cultivated land area is approximately 36,000 square kilometers. Of this, approximately 32,000 square kilometers is used for cultivating short-term crops, while the remaining nearly 4,000 square kilometers is allocated for perennial crops. Currently, the agricultural sector plays a significant role in the economy, contributing approximately 10% of GDP while employing 18% of Cuba's workforce. The Havana Matanzas Plain, located in the western part of Cuba, is considered one of the most fertile regions in the country and holds a vital position in the agriculture of this island nation. The main crops grown in this area include tobacco, sugarcane, rice, and citrus varieties. Currently, sugarcane remains Cuba's main crop. However, in 2023, the island nation only produced around 350,000 tons, the lowest yield on record. However, it cannot be denied that the sugarcane industry has made immense contributions to Cuba. Currently, products such as raw sugar, rum, and refined sugar are the main export commodities of this country. Alongside the sugarcane industry, rice production is also a key sector that the Cuban government prioritizes. Rice plays an essential role in Cuban cuisine as it is the main ingredient in many traditional dishes. On average, the annual rice consumption per capita in this country is estimated at 60 kilograms per person, equivalent to consuming over 1 kilogram of rice per week. Cuba has allocated approximately 2,000 square kilometers of coastal land in the west for rice cultivation to meet domestic demand. But in recent years, due to depleted soil and restricted fertilizer imports, rice yields have continued to decline. Currently, domestic production meets only about 45% of consumption demand, so the country spends nearly $100 million annually to import rice to cover the remaining 55% of the demand. Currently, Cuba primarily imports rice from markets such as Brazil, Uruguay, India, and Vietnam. Cuba's terrain features not only plains but also interspersed mountain ranges. The central region of the country features the Escambray mountain range, with elevations ranging from 300 to 1,100 meters, densely covered in lush vegetation, including many rare and valuable timber species. The eastern part of the island is covered by the Sierra Maestra mountain range. This is the largest and highest mountain range in Cuba. It has an elevation ranging from about 300 to 2,000 meters due to volcanic activity, forming a ridge that runs along the southern coastline. Here also stands Pico Tuchino, rising 1,974 meters above sea level, the highest peak in the country. This is also one of Cuba's most mineral-rich regions, notably nickel, a key material for producing coins, rechargeable batteries, household goods, piping systems, and stainless steel. This is the country's largest source of foreign currency. With an annual output of approximately 50,000 tons of nickel, Cuba ranks among the top 10 largest nickel-producing countries in the world. At the same time, the country also holds the second largest global nickel reserves, just behind Canada. The mountain ranges in Cuba form valleys, which are also the country's main agricultural regions. Among them, the Viñales Valley in western Cuba covers an area of approximately 132 square kilometers. Find not only breathtaking natural landscapes but also Cuba. Thanks to the suitable soil and climate conditions, this region produces tobacco plants that are more fragrant, rich, and distinctly spicier compared to other areas. Despite hundreds of cigar brands worldwide, Cuban cigars remain highly regarded for their superior quality. The most renowned cigar brands include Cohiba, Montecristo, and Partagas. However, the Cuban cigar market also has its dark side with the presence of black markets, offering cheaper alternatives for those looking to save money. Smuggled cigars are often illegally imported from neighboring countries or leaked out by workers in factories. Although the Cuban government has implemented numerous measures to control the production and distribution of cigars. However, the illegal trade of smuggled cigars continues, negatively impacting the legitimate market. Currently, this is a state-controlled mixed economy, which is also severely impacted by U.S. sanctions. Over the past decades, relations between the two countries have only had a few truly harmonious periods. Like the eras of President Jimmy Carter and President Bill Clinton. Essentially, U.S. sanctions against Cuba have increasingly become more stringent. During President Barack Obama's administration, the White House concluded that the policy of isolating Cuba, both commercially and diplomatically, had completely failed. The campaign not only failed to overthrow the Castro brothers but also ignited a wave of opposition against Washington across Latin America. Therefore, lifting the embargo on Cuba will help the U.S. regain its diminished influence. However, since Donald Trump was elected president in 2017, his administration has tightened sanctions against Cuba. At the same time, reinstate them on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Once again, this puts the island in a difficult situation. By the time President Joe Biden took office, Washington continued to ease some restrictions on the Havana government. To date, Cuba has established diplomatic relations with over 190 countries and territories, with South Korea being the latest partner. Most countries show a friendly attitude toward Cuba, except for the United States. Even Spain, the country that once ruled Cuba in the past, has declared that its government will use all necessary legal measures to prevent unilateral U.S. actions against Cuba. Additionally, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez visited Cuba in 2018. However, each country with close ties to Cuba has its own distinct issues. Japan is quite far from Cuba, while Latin American countries are generally small with limited consumer markets, coupled with unstable political situations. Whenever the government changes, its policy toward Cuba changes as well. This passage has moments of tenderness, yet also times of fierce determination as we join hands to build Cuba. Venezuela is Cuba's main oil supplier. In 2002, Hugo Chávez's government successfully overthrew the old regime with support from Cuba. From this moment on, Freedom Island has gained an exceptionally crucial ally in the region. Venezuela supplies Cuba with cheap crude oil, and in return, the island nation supports its ally by providing a large number of doctors. However, due to its economy being overly reliant on oil, Venezuela faced the resource curse shortly after President Hugo Chávez's death in 2013. Cuba's economy is facing difficulties due to a shortage of imported oil from Venezuela. Therefore, President Raúl Castro, the younger brother of the late leader Fidel Castro, decided to normalize relations with the United States and boost the development of the tourism industry. For many years, the smokeless industry has played a pivotal role in Cuba's economy. It helps improve the quality of life for many local residents. Revenue is generated from business activities such as accommodation services, restaurants, transportation, and customer care. According to information from the Cuban Ministry of Tourism and the National Office of Statistics and Information, ONEI, in 2023, they welcomed nearly 3.5 million international visitors, a figure almost equivalent to the pre-COVID-19 pandemic period. Currently, the majority of tourists come from countries such as the United States, Canada, Russia, and the European Union, EU. Among these, revenue from Chinese tourists plays an extremely vital role in the economy of this island nation. Next is China. This country and Cuba established diplomatic relations in 1960. In 2011, Beijing canceled a $6 billion debt for Havana. Currently, the United States is Cuba's largest trading partner, while also serving as both the sponsor and technology provider for this island nation. Many Chinese businesses are currently implementing projects in Cuba. Many of these projects focus on developing infrastructure, telecommunications, renewable energy, tourism, and other key sectors. On the other hand, Cuba is currently a key supplier of goods such as rum, lobster, sugar, nickel, and tobacco to the Chinese market. However, due to the vast geographical distance, trade activities between the two countries still face many limitations. The growing influence from the mainland on the crocodile-shaped island is causing great frustration for the Washington administration. According to a report from the Wall Street Journal, China and Cuba secretly signed an agreement to build an electronic eavesdropping station on the island nation's territory. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby stated that the country has expressed deep concern over the relationship between China and Cuba and is closely monitoring developments in this relationship. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia, the successor state, also adopted a moderate stance in its relations with Cuba. Although the current trade value between the two countries remains modest, Cuba and Russia have jointly announced a cooperation plan to boost their respective struggling economies. In this, Havana has committed to prioritizing Russia when it comes to accessing Cuba's resources, markets, and labor force. On Moscow's side, they are promoting Cuba as an attractive destination for Russian tourists looking to explore the Caribbean. Currently, the two countries are working toward establishing a joint rum production company to boost Cuba's export volume of this liquor, which has shown signs of decline. Russia also provided funding and technology transfer to build a steel plant, serving domestic construction projects. However, beyond geographical distance, Russia now also faces sanctions from the United States and its Western allies. The country's economy currently also relies heavily on the export of oil, gas, and agricultural products to key partner nations such as China and India. One of Cuba's most important partners is Vietnam. The two countries established diplomatic relations in 1960. During the war, Cuba provided significant aid to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. During the war, Cuba sent many road and bridge engineers to help Vietnam rebuild its heavily damaged transportation system. In addition, they also dispatched hundreds of doctors along with medicine and medical equipment to support the treatment of wounded soldiers. To repay that kindness, in 2018, Vietnam decided to forgive Cuba's debt of $143.7 million. Every year, our country also provides our ally with tens of thousands of tons of rice and food supplies, along with sending numerous teams of experts to assist. In recent years, economic and trade cooperation between the two countries has made significant progress. Bilateral trade turnover has consistently remained above $200 million United States dollars. Cuba consistently ranks among the top 10 most important markets for Vietnam in Latin America. However, since the two countries are half a world apart, cooperation in development, trade, and cultural exchange still faces many challenges. What is the current situation in Cuba? Currently, the situation is heavily impacted by the global crisis following the COVID-19 pandemic, along with trade sanctions and protectionist measures. Additionally, Cuba's demographic situation, marked by an increasingly rapid aging population and a declining birth rate, further complicates the current socio-economic landscape. Recently, the Havana government announced that gasoline prices will increase fivefold starting March 1, 2024, while also raising electricity rates by 25% for high-consumption households in residential areas compared to previous prices. This is one of the measures aimed at reducing the state budget deficit. Specifically, the price of 1 liter of regular gasoline will increase from 25 pesos, equivalent to $0.2, to 132 pesos. The highest grade gasoline will increase in price from 30 pesos to 156 pesos, equivalent to approximately 30,800 Vietnamese dong. Tourists visiting Cuba will also have to pay for gasoline in foreign currency. Currently, the Central Bank of Cuba is also studying adjustments to the new exchange rate to respond to fluctuations in the US dollar. Accordingly, the peso has been devalued twice since 2021. Previously, Cuba applied an exchange rate of 24 pesos to 1 United States dollar. According to the latest regulations, the current exchange rate is 120 pesos to $1. It cannot be denied that, after decades of imposing sanctions against Cuba, the United States has still failed to subdue this resilient nation. Moreover, Havana's closest allies are all too far away, so economically, the country has always had to rely on its own efforts. Despite its many limitations, it has also achieved significant results. Here are the natural English translations for the given Vietnamese sentences. In fact, the World Health Organization has recognized Cuba as the country with the world's most outstanding healthcare system, even in the treatment of critical illnesses. Despite the economic challenges, they still allocate up to 23% of the national budget to invest in healthcare. All healthcare services are government managed and provided free of charge to the public. Currently, Cuba has one of the highest doctor-to-population ratios in the world, with approximately 8.4 doctors per 1,000 people. In contrast, this ratio is only 2.6 doctors per 1,000 people in the United States and 4.1 doctors per 1,000 people in Italy. In recent years, Cuba has become an attractive destination, drawing large numbers of tourists. In addition to exploring tropical recreational activities, many travelers also choose to combine their trip with healthcare services. Includes cosmetic surgery and post-accident rehabilitation. The medical tourism industry is making a significant contribution to Cuba's economy by attracting thousands of tourists from North America and Europe. People are drawn by the doctor's reputation, cost-saving services, and the allure of resort beaches. Moreover, despite facing numerous economic challenges, Cuba has dispatched over 124,000 medical professionals to provide healthcare services in 154 countries. Additionally, the American Latin Medical School in La Habana also admits over 20,000 students from various countries around the world to study medicine. Above is the geographical information about Cuba. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Goodbye, and see you in the next episodes.